Hello everyone, a bit of church history today as we talk about the Patarian movement. We already made some videos about this, maybe not specifically on the Pataria or Pataria, I don't know what the accent plays in here, but introducing it, let's say, together with essentially other premises of the Gregorian reforms. And it's a phenomenon that, of course, is inextricably connected with it, as together with Hermetism, we'll see now, with the issues that were, in fact, emerging between the papacy and empire, would bring to the investiture controversy, and this is what it is. But also this broader instances of church reform that were being felt at the time, also in the monastic movement, that would be quite influential, also in its, in some ways, also in its Hermetic branch, properly for the creation of the papal monarchy. Right? These are very, very important topics that we overlook tremendously, I guess, in our education as Westerners. Not much just the history of the church in itself that nobody really understands anymore, but ecclesiologically and broadly meant what Christianity achieved in the centuries. That was really impressive, considering the broader civilizational necessity to organize the system into somewhat more, in fact, hierarchical one, and that would accompany all an important, a deep cultural turn towards a more rational, essentially, and scientific-oriented character of the church. But without going too far, and today this is just an appetizer about the Pataria, because it's a complex phenomenon that we won't go in tremendous detail about, but trying to fix at least the most important aspects of. But it's still a relatively archaic times, right? So we are at the beginning of the 11th century. So also in here, in a moment that we just imagine it, right? England is still ruled by the Anglo-Danish. The Crusades are not there, and the papacy has still to take that dramatic turn, and many powers now are still either in embryonic form, in a way, have just joined Roman Catholicism, and so Europe is starting to put itself powerfully in motion, but still there has to be an organization, has to come to the top to lead this. There have been key figures like Pope Sylvester II, Schwerpunkt of Aurillac, that provided the Roman Church with this dramatically universal and properly even scientific sense of itself. Right, a model that the church paradoxically will manage to develop better than the empire at this point. With the Ottonians, is actually the end of the Ottonians is actually declining, passing to another phase of the Franconians that, in fact, will be ultimately, acknowledging the regression. Like in Ottonian times, I don't know, Otto III ruled from Rome in spite of all the difficulties with that. The Franconians have to acknowledge at some point at the beginning of the 12th century that, aside from all the excommunications they got, but that the struggle for investitures in Italy was lost for them, and broadly speaking, thus as, for them in general, as a universal power that had to claim, that had surrendered, let's say, these prerogatives to the papacy south of the Alps, and many other issues related to this, even in German policy. But the Pataria is a popular movement of some sort. So it's important to stress also how in this most developed areas of Europe, so southern France, the Rhineland, northern and central Italy, these movements will, the broader instances of church reform will begin to agitate some currents that will become actually very dangerous, as especially the next century with the Cathars would prove, and other, fringe movements, etc. Even in there, we should understand technically what these people wanted, because you can never disjoint this from it's not a merely ecclesiastical. Everything ecclesiastical in nature is political, like everything, right? And that was the problem of it all at the end of the day. Excuse me, drink a little. As I had been talking before this video already. And the, let's say, certain problems had never properly been surpassed even since ancient times, because most of these agitations in the in the High Middle Ages were, in a sense, symptomatic of a revival of the masses, right? As it had never been seen since late antiquity, and so you can argue that since the moment in which Christianity had affirmed itself as official religion of the empire, the intellectual elites of the Christian world had lived a sort of fracture internally, right? Think about the uncompromising, instances of Tertullian, right? That condemns and goes against even St. Paul on certain minor issues, but still significantly as a moment where much of what the Christian state would have become later on was yet to be properly made and tested, and so, or others that were reconciliating. In fact, in a later in later phase where the state was properly Christian and had to, in a sense, even involve the ecclesiastical elites in part of the rule, and with a conciliating vision, like the Augustinian one. It was still relatively fringe in many ways. That Augustine was recovering many, important limit theories of St. Paul, and that even the St. Luther would continue in the wake of certain aspects of, in fact, the St. Grace that had been debated, at that point. And you can argue that the early Middle Ages had brought to the fading of these issues because the same intellectual vivacity, right, and cultural activity had been dispersed in other, to cope with other needs, but needs that the church at that point had also to take the reins of at the evaporation of the Roman state. But the problem, in a sense, was not surpassed. What about Theodosius' Christendom, right? At that point, with the full officialization of Christianity as religion of state, you have winning and triumphing Christianity that had conquered the world as the Roman Empire had done. But the question there was, to which end? Because, Jesus said pretty clearly that his reign was not the one of this world, right? And St. Paul had taught that, yes, you have to be in the world, within the world, physically, but let's say you're not of the world, that there is something that reaches beyond yourself, that it belongs to somewhere else. Justice doesn't belong to this world, and yet you are an agent in the world itself, and so this made you connected with God in ways that implied, yes, an action in the world, but about which the Gospels had always remained relatively, and willingly and correctly, can't say ambivalent, but say still offering you kind of a double thread on which to reason on. That is to say, the one of your physical mortality, but your spiritual mortality, in as much as yes, there is a finite world with some limits, and a human nature rigged by sin, etc. But there is an extra element that through grace can save you, but that still you should contribute for the will of to make good in this world through the deeds, through the action. So how did the two things intertwine? It's the, in a way, that was the sap, the civilizational sap of Christianity. The idea that in the moment in which you this belonged also to, you can find it also in Judaism. Some of the great rabbi traditions stress the same thing, essentially, that I don't know, that you should consider yourself as that as if the world has been made for you, as it was, as the creation serves fundamentally that purpose, but at the same time the fact that you will turn into dust again. So it's within this extreme that the existential, the unspeakable existential experience, say, happens properly, and you are essentially the one endowed with the freedom of conscience, and that always allows you to make a choice, always enables you to make the difference in a sense, and therefore to decide every time, autonomously, still with a great, with faith and obedience, but still, for this reason, extremely careful, extremely challengedly, let's say, looking at a world that you don't fully understand, that you have to cope with, and therefore that stimulates constantly your sense of responsibility. So, what does it mean to be in the world for the church? Because that's essentially what the church stands for. Like, the imperial church, in late antiquity, but especially later, the Carolingian and Teutonian one, had, of course, taken on, properly on its clergy, the, say, a non-small part of the temporal government, where this was a natural process, right? It's irrealistic, I would say, from a strictly physical point of view, physical meant as probably the natural science, to presume that any power can, that you can't have a secular, a temporal intervention, if you are a human being in the first place, right? You can't externate yourself from the world. In a sense, you're doomed to do that. And so when you think of the church and all the criticism, but the church had wealth, the church had, yes, and so, like, how do you think a church can exist in the world without property, without power, without coercion? There is no human community that works, but the church is not an exception, and especially should not be, right? Even according to the scriptures. So it was absolutely natural that because of the rarefaction and the weakening of public powers, the ecclesiastical hierarchies were often called to essentially compensate, both because because both the bishops and abbots were generally expression of the same aristocratic families. The public powers were entrusted to, and we've seen this in. We made a video on Gérald of Aurillac, that was this basically Miles, right? At that point, it was still, however, so a secular hero that was transformed into a holy one, a sacred one, because they were the same individuals, and that kind of attitude was kind of accepted socially, especially when you see what bishops did in many areas, especially of France, Germany, when after the second invasions struck, and the empire was collapsing, and therefore what were the most powerful actors in that situation? There were bishops, mainly the main cities that were also more easily defendable, were detached from central power, that even properly from a geographical point of view had never been central as such, but still that had to more peripheral sense to work on their own. And so they would obviously think about, the military organization and taking part to the operations and all these things. How could the world actually work without, right? It would have not made any sense. And so we've seen this also in other videos regarding, for example, the practices of marriage, of the clergy, etc. There were certain areas of Europe where everything had taken even properly autonomously a direction on its own, where the it wasn't, nobody saw that overlapping of spiritual and temporal matters as an issue in the first place. In part was also proper ignorance of Christianity, of the scriptures, of the fathers, etc. But in other ways was also kind of functional to a society in a way that even on the same base, the same scriptures base was kind of opinable, right? Where councils had not properly maybe addressed the issue, for example, or still the same ecclesiastical organization had not reached a point which a regulation was needed to make things work, right? Or to present with some specific problems. And this had always existed since the beginning of the church, because that's a community of humans like all the others. So kind of pretending that this should be kind of more kind of purer or more somewhat consistent morally than other, it's unrealistic, because by thinking that you basically admit that to you most issues are not really a problem. You just feel like to blame the ones that should, for some kind of hypocritical reasons, show to be the most morals, while you're doing nothing. And so all communities at the time were dramatically pressured, and it's obvious that even today people don't understand or care about the church anymore, because they properly don't understand what historically what it's meant to be and what it was, right? So they just conclaim their ignorance rather than expressing any kind of meaningful opinion on such matters. In any case, the lack of a safe, say, clear guideline that would in fact dictate the choice, the appointment, and the education, the instruction of the clergy could, objectively, would bring to an impoverishment, spiritually speaking, of religious life, also to a weak and unsatisfactory guidance of the communities of the faithful that needed not just spiritual nourishment, but also something more in terms properly of discipline, of coercion, of control, and here all the connection with also the secular, the prerogatives of secular government were very important. And yes, too, absolutely not, perfect, let's put it this way, moral behavior. And again, there is no doubt about this, and it's not even something strange. But in the rarefaction of the social relations that are characteristic of the feudal age, such contradictions between the professions of the professional Christian faith and lifestyle had been less evident, right? Because again, those who ruled society were basically the same people by extraction, by cultural background, right? This was the idea. There were some lords, there were counts, marquises, whatever, the same kings, and they had children, and these children would be either secular rulers in the case of males. Sometimes also females could inherit that, but it's more like an exception. Others instead would go to the clergy, and the son of a duke or some, or the daughter wouldn't be just normal clergy. They would be bishops, archbishops, abbots, abbesses, right? So powerful people that were fundamentally coming from the same family background. There was mostly a military one. And so that therefore knew perfectly well how the word worked consistently, that were put at the head of this extremely powerful land realities like monasteries, abbeys, that were really powerful, militarily capable, politically, very influent, also international centers of enormous wealth. They controlled lots of serfs, lots of workers, a lot of people working for them and gravitating around them. That had also a great culture because, of course, the monasteries, the ecclesiasticals were in a cultural sense, and also in a spiritual sense, the connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe. And thus, these people were just politicians, were rulers, were obviously, living in a world that also didn't present with any other different model, because, again, especially north of the Alps, and that's also where we talk about the Patarian in terms of the fact that it was a city expression also of the Mediterranean world by a certain degree, but not just there, as we were saying before, that there were important centers also in Central Europe, etc., that expressed this. But was different. It was presenting with another dimension that was especially the one of the increase of power of the lower classes that were soon becoming the rich ones, right? The powerful ones that were previously not really contemplated to have this capacity, and also instances in relatively to Christian life would be an issue. And the cultural divide in many ways is important, because you can read what would happen eventually also with the struggle, the investiture controversy and so on, also as a clash between two different political and social models. Right? It was difficult for the church to reform from, for example, mostly a Central European Frankish standpoint, right? The relevance of the Roman Church, of the administrative, let's say the Roman, administrative legacy in countries like Italy, and the studying of law, the levels of literacy, properly the different, in fact, social tissue with so many transactions, think about traffics, etc., would change European history, as you know, for good, in the contrast that occurred between these two areas that still somewhat remained together. Think about the Holy Roman Empire and its latitudinal extension. What you would wonder why such also quite distant areas of Europe would, culturally speaking, would bond, would join, in spite of also of all the strife that came with that. So much more than what probably the elites were thinking about by the early 11th century was at stake for what would have happened later, but also much more than what we usually think was at stake already by the early 11th century. What was quite concrete, as, again, here we're talking about already the debate over what pertained to universal powers. And from the top to the bottom of society. So we will talk again, of course, about the investiture controversy, and there is no need to say to take that side to explain the Pataria. Let's just say that in the first decades of the 11th century, the most uncompromising reformers recurred often to the help of the lay authorities. Especially, not the traditional ones, like the great feudal aristocracy, but we're talking about sometimes the middle classes, like merchants, artisans. Especially in Italy, where the Patari emerged, like by the small gentrified feudality. So urban knights, for example, as we will see, there would be very important in the Patarian movement. But as a broader, force, right, work and even fighting force in a sense, by what would you call the proletariat in a sense, such as the very small artisans and the salaried workers that, again, were not particularly typical of, just like the city was not particularly typical north of the Alps, in the way it was properly the city, not just a town or something else emerged. And this scale of kind of industrial activity, like in the great centers of northern Italy that were already internationally connected, where this thing takes place in Milan for a reason. And there was a lot of demagogy gravitating around this, because these masses were naturally, let's say, instigated against the clergy that was against the reform, right? And nobody knew how this reform should have taken place, nor nobody actually envisaged what the papacy would actually reform like, right? And there was also an important political and moral dimension to it intertwined, because the accusations towards the clergy was the higher clergy was to have carried out sins of simony or concubinage. It was said that in among the 5,000 priests of Milan, just 5 were not simoniac. Simony comes from essentially the purchasing of the ecclesiastical office, and so all what pertained, the sacred that pertained to it, comes from Simon Magus, from the Bible, that tries to to corrupt the apostles for getting for purchasing the magic that he saw in Christ, etc. So hence they were called at the time, and such movements were particularly spread. In fact, as we were just saying, in the very populated cities of the Po Valley, and also in Tuscany, which is overlooked because something similar to what would occur in Milan, as we'll see now, actually happened also in our Tuscan centers and so on. And the Pataria was fundamentally the most typical of these movements. It was not even in fact, the only one, nor the necessarily even just the most developed, but let's say the one that would carry out the greatest turmoil, right? This term, Pataria, is of Lombard origin. It means probably, maybe, rag seller, right? So its qualification with some contempt refers to the at least mediocre social status of its participants. And in Milan, where the Patarians were guided by the deacon Ariald and by the knight Erlembald, they wouldn't hesitate to attack, even harshly, the clergy that had remained loyal to the Emperor Henry IV, that at this point was, in fact, struggling, as you know, against Gregory VII, that was the initiator, let's say, of that new direction that would have been actually resumed in a properly monarchic sense of the papacy, to autonomize completely the ecclesiastical control from the secular activities, from the secular authorities. As it had happened during Antonian times, that paradoxically had provided with the same necessity of reforming the church in order to justify the secular control on it, because of course the church was corrupted also before, when it was, especially in Rome, in the hands of the great Roman families in the city, and that had ended up with the excommunication of the emperor, with the civil war in Germany as a consequence, and even the humiliation of the Saint Henry IV at Canossa, famously enough, that however didn't put an end to the struggle with the papacy in itself, but that had created big fractures within all the empire, and so at that point across the whole political and social spectrum. So what had happened in Milan practically is that this is a bit like the prefiguration of what would be in theory Ghibellinism and Guelphism later on, where it's just another phase that you can say was evident during the Patarian movement, mostly from a social point of view, but also it was deeply political. That is, the cities like Milan were essentially expanding fast, right? Milan in 1 century would have been the largest city in Europe, or even before that, and still at this point was surely one of the most organized and developed and rich, etc. And therefore this was escaping, like the communal experience would prove, let's say, the feudal hierarchy of the empire, which means that up to that point, more or less, Germany, Italy had been ruled from on the base of the great districtual repartitions, feudal repartitions of Carolingian origin, at least. So I don't know, there were the dukes of the marquises of Tuscany, of the March of Verona, all these, and they were, so they, in theory, these lords that ruled on everything, cities included. But the cities were, the feudality was losing ground. All these knights were also urbanizing, gentrifying, because they needed to, they saw opportunities in these cities from which they kept ruling, right? The first consular movement, even in these cities, was essentially of military nature, and there is a radically military character in the birth of the Italian communes. And so these were violent movements that were essentially contesting, not much. What would a textile worker in early 11th century Milan actually care or understand or do about theology, right? These people just wanted to be fundamentally autonomous from the feudal hierarchy, right? So what did this mean is that the papacy, you see, at this point, it was naturally very important and so on, but there was also a somewhat an autonomy of the great ecclesiastical offices throughout the empire. That is, Rome at this point really connected the whole Western Christendom with the papacy having a clamorous spiritual authority. It was recognized, but still carrying out together with secular ones, the evangelization of Central Northern Europe, all these things. But it wouldn't control directly, the Archdiocese of Milan, right? That traditionally also was, in that case, just like Ravenna, for example, or Paris, like something else traditionally, right? But there were, you can argue, different countries in many ways, and the issue here was mostly the papacy managing to enter these struggles where the middle classes wanted to create, or not even the middle classes as we intended, as again shopkeepers, etc., but even knights, local nobility wanted to emancipate themselves from the higher feudal nobility and say, we don't recognize you because you're essentially constantly interfering, or in this sense also being corrupted with the spiritual affairs from a secular standpoint, and this shouldn't be, right? And if all the ecclesiastical offices were normally bought, and since Ottonian times the local clergy was essentially, if not appointed, properly confirmed by imperial authority, and so becoming factually, as bishop counts mostly in Ottonian Italy, that's the leitmotif, right? The actual rulers of the land. The question is, at the rise of, social elements that were becoming stronger in the city and could even compete with the bishop's power, let's say, what there would be a disqualification of that authority, because let's say we want to rule, and if you don't have enough power to, and if you don't even at that point fit what we think should be the ideal spiritual side of the story, which practically meant usurping the episcopal prerogatives, or at least working on their behalf, factually controlling them, we want to exonerate from. And this is exactly what would happen. I mean, most of what you see even later in the Italian communal movement is the commune actually being born out the same episcopal administration and prerogatives. The communes were acting very often on behalf of the episcopal rights, because they were the ones that roughly overlapped with the rule on the surrounding districts, right? The surrounding districts were, since Roman times, essentially the same ones, which the city more or less had a very strong and direct connection to and control of, right? In feudal times, yes, there were some rural aristocracy that had still and would remain, even in countries like Italy, very deeply, entrenched in their own prerogatives, that albeit still entering the city policy as well, and so on, the city politics, I mean. But the idea was still that the commune would expand at that point from the city on behalf of the bishop rights that were still the public ones, because the Ottonians had endowed the bishops with the same comital authority over that district, so properly also the secular one. And so the city simply took that prerogative and began to expand. Milan would do somewhat the same thing in surrounding territories, starting to subjugate even the local nobility, the rural one, and so on, expanding the city's control over the surroundings. So lots of things were seriously starting here to happen that would prefigurate the later developments. It would be clamorous in European history. And contesting the episcopal fitness to the role, as much as the fact that this had acquired the same public one by imperial confirmation, so still by a public authority that the same citizens recognized in theory, right? As long as it didn't become too oppressive, but still, that was how the thing would go, right? You see, the Ottonians had been very glad to do this in Italy, because differently from Germany, where the nobility, the lay nobility was very powerful, and also the ecclesiastical one in a way, but still having a sort of rural base, and in spite of the importance of the cities of the Rhineland and so on. In Italy, there was much less of feudal power. There were much less powerful aristocracies in the countryside. So, when the Ottonians came to Italy, they saw that the city was already very powerful. Unlike north of the Alps, the bishops traditionally, since the late antiquity, ruled there as administrators. So they thought, well, saying, you know what, even though there are secular lords in the countryside, they're somewhat powerful. As you know, the Italic kingdom at some point also rebelled feudally against the Ottonians. There was some Italian aristocracy properly that contended even not just the royal, but consequently the imperial crown through the process. The rise of the cities basically choked the feudal element, the landed one that was not in the city, and so there you have the communes. All right, so it was very important for the Ottonians to say in the city, let's simply confirm somebody that already rules in there, that plus is clergy, so cannot inherit just like the lay can do, and therefore that we can control and kind of appoint at our pleas, we can remove, etc. So that's why, and they had done again this by saying we can appoint these bishops because, of course, bishops normally succeed more frequently than the lay men, and they don't claim any kind of inheritance there. So we have this capacity of interfering with the election, and the reason, and the same was for Rome, right? So popes were created by the Ottonians and so on, and the moral justification was saying that we do so because if the local communities started appointing their own bishops, they would just be expression of the local aristocracy, of the local nobility, and therefore instead we want fit bishops also from a spiritual point of view. Hence, the germs of the Reformations eventually would turn against the same emperors in the investiture controversy, because the papacy began to claim the same thing from Rome, starting making leverage on such rise of the lower classes to oust what the previous elites imperially nominated were, and so acquiring also as an international power greater control on the situation, and so being able to mobilize all these forces against the emperor. And you got to admit it's pretty clever. What was in between though was the popular instances, because you know how the people can get easily radicalized and ideologized and kind of obeying to certain logics that do not really fit an orderly civilizational development, which the papal monarchy quite splendidly embodied and managed, in fact, consequently to suppress also the most radical heterodox, if not properly heresy, that stemmed from the same humus, mostly this urban classes from northern Italy, from southern France, from the Rhineland, the most developed areas in Europe, urbanly wise, and so the ones that were also a bit more atypical and difficult to control, exactly because of this force that the city somewhat embodied in the form of surplus, and whoever could control that, and it's obvious that these were starting to be the hubs of international trade and the cradle of early, a lot of money were circulating there. So also for the broader universal policies of papacy and empire, the cities were crucial to be won over, right? So hence even the investiture controversy continued in the guise later on of the wars of Frederick Barbarossa against the Lombard League, and all what that meant also culturally, with, for example, the recovery of Roman law and the different interests that the cities had, and to back the emperor or the papacy according to their own, in fact, convenience. And so that's why the Pataria is so relevant in this picture, because it really prefigurates a direction that Europe would take, and that the universal powers would have to take care of also, as in part as their own creation, in part of as something that was developing, in fact, out of their control and already previously to their interference, or at least in a way that could be somewhat capable of managing it. And there were radical instances where, for example, in Milan, there was a ferocious violence. We're talking about urban battles, a freaking mess. Inquisition, also in the countryside, in other cities, in other centers. Milan, let's stress this, that the Italic crown was essentially connected to it. So if anybody wanted to become Holy Roman Emperor, had to pass through Milan, because it doesn't matter whether they were crowned in places like Monza or Pavia traditionally, but Milan was now the most powerful Lombard city. So independently from the military control that it would start having in a while, literally even on other cities in the next century, if its political ramifications were on a very large scale. So if you wanted to be an emperor, you had to take control of the situation there, because otherwise there was no way to Rome or properly to all the institutional ether to be crowned emperors in the first place. And the people went radical at some point, but they had a logic into that. This is the ancient. These things had all happened in the late antiquity. It was about think about the Donatist movement in Africa in the 5th century. That was basically the same idea. It was about the fitness of the clergy, the purity of the clergy. And so in Milan, at this point, in the 11th century, was the profanation of the sacraments, because the people refused to consider as valid the Eucharistic consecration, as it was made by a Simoniac priest. And it did make sense, because there was literally the idea that which is an heresy at the end of the day, because it's as if there had been some kind of material contamination of evil from a priest that is unfit, right? Eventually the church would establish that it doesn't matter where the priest is unfit. Still, if the faithful has, is perfect in his intentions, the sacrament is valid. Doesn't matter how evil and corrupted the priest is. This is relevant because it's obvious that behind such radical popular reactions, there was an attempt to also overthrow the social order. This is something that you see, the heresies especially that would spread during the 12th century, starting from this background, right? It wasn't much about a theological issue. It was sometimes literally a classist revolt. It was about massacring the clergy, stealing their property, all things that kind of came back at every kind of confessional clash in a way, to justify the crime, that aimed at the top, aimed at literally overthrowing the elites and kind of taking over. And we know that historically speaking, these things usually do not lead anywhere, because you can even achieve that, but then these people usually have no idea what to do in practice with anything. So of course the elites are needed and are the only ones that can put things in order and would get things in order back, also making a pretty bloody cleansing of these masses. So the Wolf-Catter thing, and don't think in fact that these masses had any kind of spiritual superiority over the church. Again, it's pretty naive and illiterate to presume that in order to have a church, this church doesn't have to be powerful in some way. Society was corrupted at the time, as everywhere, right? Later, of course, after the Protestant Reformation was all historiographical branch that stressed the fact that, I don't know, in the Middle Ages, the church was so corrupted. Yes, because what was the rest of society identically like, right? How can you distinguish the two things? Why would the church not be, they're just people. Why wouldn't they be corrupted like others? Actually, the church was one of the, and thanks especially to the Reformation, in an aristocratic sense, in a monarchic sense, much more orderly and disciplined and actually functional, also in terms of properly avoiding corruption in a sense, than other institutions. I mean, there is no doubt about this. Looking at the Inquisition, it was actually a very efficient, guarantistic tribunal that needed a very specific procedure with evidence, with proofs. It was something that the secular tribunals simply didn't care about most of the time. It would just take you in and do whatever we want with you. The church was extremely careful with these things instead, and it also, of course, it fit a broader popular need to have such authority and control on something that helped people even to become literate, educated, right? So unfortunately, making these points seems right. I understand probably half of my audience has never even heard of such things, or to think it's a sort of twisted narrative or whatever, but this is actual history in the way it's told basically everywhere. But like, nobody thinks anymore that the church was in this sense any kind of force of evil or regression, or at least especially in this context, right? You can't start seeing maybe the 18th century, the 19th century as a force that was at that point hampering a broader, with also the good that came with modernity, aside from the evil that surely was brought together with it. But during the Middle Ages, if you properly don't grasp the magnitude of the superiority of the ecclesiastical civilization, you can't quite understand anything about the Middle Ages in itself. And it's not a surprise that there is so much tribalism and, and neo-paganism and all these delusions that, of course, have nothing to do with the Middle Ages or the pagans or whatever, because it's mostly like a neo-modernistic, progressivistic, medievalistic delusion that people buy into just because they are the new the new lower classes. They're the new emarginated. They breed hatred and frustration against the elites because they realize that they don't have the means anymore to reach that level. And it is a problem. It's just that, that kind of attitude is not the solution. The solution is for you to become elite because of your own capacity, like the elites became by virtue in that way. The capacity of some sort, at least, that is functional to the progress of civilization. So no, I don't. Let's say it would be disconcerting even to see what actually was happening at that point in these cities, because we know of unspeakable violence. But there was for the first time in Europe, by a certain scale at least, we witnessed to very to a deep ideologization of policy in these struggles, right? Which is typical, in fact, of the more advanced context, the need a broader narrative to support their action. And this narrative surely fit important prerogatives that were not just moralistic in nature, but had to do properly with the management or the government of even just a city like Milan. That again, Europe at this point was bringing cities to boom again in a way that never been seen before, and that this case Milan was pioneering. And so we could go on with this point, but you understand, the forces that were agitating behind, and the interests as a consequence that were agitating behind these movements as well, that would even transcend the mere ecclesiological question. And so you have this strange couple, that is the ecclesiastical reformers from one side, that were sometimes they were radical in their own ways. Hermetism, as we were saying before, was quite key in the creation of papal monarchy, which is interesting because hermits are not literally aristocracy, but let's say the level of ideologism that was needed to bring in the forces to affirm a monarchy and of that scale of control was quite relevant. Think about Pier Damiani, that was sent by the popes to mediate things were happening in Milan at that point. Well, he had quite a curriculum, but there is properly a lower level of, let's say, of this emerging clergy as well, that was backing those instances of reform from within the same church, and it eventually succeeded. And these reformers were backing the Patarians. This was the strange couple. As an external force, in a sense, at least as long as they were men of the Pope. Excuse me, drink a little. And part of the glue that kept them together was the competition against the emperor. Because, of course, as we've seen, the Germanic rulers wanted to maintain a control on the Italian peninsula, even though they weren't quite, so eager to descend in there anymore, or at least, at that point they also had internal issues, including the ones created by the same popes in order to avoid them to descend into Italy, by keeping them busy against the German nobility. That was very glad to exploit, in that sense, even the instances of a reformation. Right? If you could say to a German prince that they could essentially disown their feudal obligations towards the emperor because he was an heretic and excommunicated, well, the Pope said that the source of sacred were free, right? And the German princes, basically all their lives, didn't wait for anything but that. And so that's also how you would control the thing. And we will see this better, perhaps, in our series on medieval Germany, because that brought also to an important development of German power, paradoxically, at least in its federal mechanism, and in the way eventually in the 12th century also managed to leverage an important amount to levy an important amount, at least, of forces, even for the Mediterranean policy, the Italian expeditions, and so on. So the ecclesiastical reformers aimed at eliminating lay influence from the church. So, in other words, imperial interference. The popes at that point were not much concerned just about the local aristocracy. They were cared about properly having, an upper hand over the clergy appointment that would parallel the imperial one. That's what they were building. And and the Patarians instead were the brutal force of chaos that kind of fantasized about the let's say a church epurated from any mundane and material aspect. So in other words, Manichaeanism, Gnosticism, and it's not a surprise that Catarism would come about at that point. So a church of the poor and the equal. So it's basically the delusions where we are confronted with today. So a completely and radically abstracted subjectivism with no kind of standards, that just is based on a completely abstract delusion of what humanity and the community and politics concretely are, right? And even physical reality should be. I mean, not that the Patarians were all crazies, for that matter. There were also much more concrete interests, but, still they were quite turbulent force in that regard. And, that at the end of the day, all these expectations would be frustrated. Not because the church won, the papacy won, but because simply you don't build a civilization with such ideas. Because it doesn't work, right? Like all utopias. So with the death of Gregory VII and the pontificates of Urban II, and eventually after the parenthesis of Paschal II and Calixtus II, the Patarians realized, in fact, that their church of the poor would have never been found. Not only the papacy was recovering essentially the older hierarchies against they had themselves fought. That's another point, right? If you have a local bishop that fundamentally understands that it's kind of more convenient to be co-opted by the papacy than by the emperor, that's good. You have already somebody powerful in that city that knows how to rule it, has all administrative personnel, etc. And at this point, in fact, the communes were still not born. So also that skilled administrative, educated, literally lay personnel, lawyers, etc., that worked for the bishop, but eventually would be the ones forming the communal government later on. But they were coming from that milieu. But at this point, it was mostly still working for the church. So it was not a univocal change in terms of political allegiance in the broader schemes of universal powers. But indeed, these popular movements were mostly, from a social point of view, were mostly put down, brought again to order, and so even the Patarians, in part, kind of bent, and they came back sensibly within the order of a church that had, at that point, found a sort of compromise that was very far from their hopes, but still was better than nothing. That is to say, at least having the church declaring itself untouchable from the emperor, and so being at least disconnected from that kind of influence. Other Patarians instead took their, the radical direction. They I don't know. Some went to pilgrimage. They participated to the crusades that would be now launched. Why? But they were already happening factually in the Tyrrhenian Sea, in the Iberian Peninsula, and so on, well before 1095. Or they withdrew in prayer sometimes even living a hermetic life. Others still even drew from the compromise closed by the church and imperial authority the conviction that by that point the ecclesiastical institutions as such were far from the message of Christ, and therefore they would have had to abandon or to substitute with different ones. And this is what factually matured the passage from the Pataria to heresy, to open heresy, because this was already borderline, as you understand, that would have almost overwhelmed Western Christendom in the 12th century, which is yet another civilizational phenomenon of massive scale that today, if you ask the average person what happened in the 12th century, they don't quite realize, and that is that we're actually very closely similar to nowadays, and with the only difference that, at the time, the elites were, capable and understanding, and aware of the risks. Today, a bit less, maybe, or maybe it's just, a bit of pinch of pessimism not to lower the guard, but still, I don't think it is, because the elites seem to be the same ones that, of course, you see how similar it is, though, right? The same papacy fueled those things as long as they were useful. It's like today, right? Some elites fuel such radical subjectivistic delusions just to gain power, and then eventually the average people becomes always poorer because, of course, kind of you called it on yourself, right? Just for believing such nonsense. But at the end, the result invariably is the elite taking over, and a much greater grip on the lower classes. At least this is what normally happens. It doesn't mean that it always have to happen, but in general, it happens so frequently that one should draw some conclusion from it in general. Not much as a constant struggle per se, but about the idea that at some point people break because they don't have the motivation anymore to insist on something, and they may find themselves in situations where they simply could have not done much in the first place, and that's why they sided, in fact, with those extremistic ideologies in the first place. So it's an interesting phase, but it's important to enucleate it for what the Pataria concretely was. And again, at some point we make videos that actually go much more in detail on the events, because they're fascinating. They tell you also how complex they really were. But for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.